times in the New Testament, disciples are described as joining together to break bread. Jesus is mentioned as breaking bread with the disciples when he was with them in the upper room. This event happened before he went with his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane to be arrested before crucifixion, and it's often referred to as the Last Supper. Another occasion was when Paul gathered with Christians in Acts 20, where he preached until midnight. And don't worry, I'm not as long-winded as Paul. Paul's long sermon induced sleep in a young man named Eutychus, who fell out of the window and died. Paul raised him from the dead, and then the disciples all broke bread together. What in the world does this phrase mean? How are we supposed to understand it? It is clearly important because the young church was said to devote themselves to it. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Ultimately, it can mean two different things. In the case with Jesus in the upper room, it was clearly a significant celebration and remembrance. This story is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then Paul retells this story in his first letter to the Corinthians. This breaking bread was a purposeful remembrance of the life and death of Jesus. Other times, like the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus took fish and loaves of bread and broke the bread so all could eat. This breaking of bread did not seem to have any significance. It was just a meal, albeit a miraculous meal. It is clear that the phrase break bread is an idiom, an expression to mean they ate together. Sometimes those meals were just meals, times of fellowship and togetherness. For instance, the early church was described as breaking bread in their homes. They did this day by day, and it seemed to be a common meal. Later in Acts 6, some were being left out of the daily distribution of food. The early disciples ate together often. On some occasions, this sharing of food was a special event. The breaking of bread in remembrance of the Lord's life, death, and resurrection, which seemed to be when they were gathered together to worship on the Lord's Day, was one special event. The obvious question is, to which should we be devoted, since the early church was devoted to the breaking of bread? The answer is simple. Both. When God's people are together, whether it is to remember Christ or just to encourage one another with love, we should be there. We should devote ourselves to serving Him and one another. The next time you get a chance to break bread, go. Participate. Enjoy God's blessings of food, fellowship, and faith.